In the name of the Creator, Redeemer, and Giver of life. Amen. Please be seated. Let's do this. There we go. Okay. So, you're probably wondering why on earth I decided to change the gospel reading this week to such a boring, drab list of very hard to pronounce names. I'm glad you asked, he said rhetorically. We have been, those who have been in the New Testament class are very aware of the fact that oftentimes the church kind of starts its story at Jesus and assumes that Jesus is really the beginning of our story. That is just not the case, not even close. In fact, it took us 8 weeks to get into the New Testament itself. Because there's so much backfill, so much information that needs to be brought forward to even begin to understand what the heck is going on in the New Testament. That's why in the next few weeks we're doing pre-nativity readings from the Gospels of Matthew and Luke to reconnect us not only to the Old Testament, but also to the time between the Testaments and the recognition that Advent is the anticipation of the birth of Jesus, not the birth of Jesus itself. And these are important stories. So, let's dive in. First and foremost, this Matthew's genealogy, which is different from Luke's genealogy, starts with Abraham. Now, pop quiz, bonus if you can tell me, who does Luke's genealogy start with? Anybody? Adam. Actually, interestingly enough, Moses plays into neither of the genealogies. Interesting fact. So why Abraham? Abraham is considered sort of the father of Judaism and also an exemplar of what it means to be faithful to the God of Israel. What's also interesting is that he was the first convert. And why is that? Well, when God called him, he called him to leave his father's house in his father Ur in Chaldea, who was an idol maker for pagan gods, and follow the God of Israel. So from the very first out the gate, he's the son of this patriarch of the tradition. But he's also the embodiment of both the family of Israel and the God of Israel, and also Gentile fidelity to the God of Israel. So first and foremost, it's signaling things. If you look at this genealogy as just a genealogy of a listing of names, that's actually not what it's trying to accomplish. In fact, there's one point where he skips 5 generations because he wants to get the 14 number correct. 14 being completion. So then he goes on and on and on and on, and then he ends off the first set of 3 14s with whom? King David. Why King David? He's the pinnacle of the monarchy. He's also the one that is, at least depending on which part of the Bible you go to, is the one with whom God promised an eternal covenant of the monarchy of David. Now, if you look at Kings, or 1st and 2nd Samuel, that's where you get that. But if you look at Chronicles, it's conditional. So there's debate about that. So already signaling the significance for Matthew of the fulfillment of the promise to David to restore the monarchy. So the next one starts out with David and then goes through to the deportation of Babylon, from the pinnacle to the dregs. And then after the deportation, so Jeconiah was the last king before Babylon overthrew it, and then it resolves itself through the return from exile all the way to the time of Jesus. But the question is, are there actually 14 names in this last section of 3? The answer is no. Jesus is the last one, which gives the hint that, in fact, the church, the followers of Jesus, and the fulfillment of that are the completion of this third set of 14. I know this is a little technical today. I promise we're going somewhere with it. Another fun, interesting fact is that there's a lot of dads and sons, dads and sons, dads and sons. But there are 4 women mentioned in this. Now, why might these four women be introduced? Well, first of all of them were, but according to tradition, Gentiles that became part of the community. Some of them had more interesting backgrounds than others, like Rahab doing her the spies from Jericho going in to stay with her for research and development, as Gwen put it a few years ago. And but what's interesting is that the unconventionality of all of these women, especially with several of them with their means of conception, most of which were not in strictly traditional means, gives weight and legitimacy to Mary, which is a really kind of cool thing. Because Tamar had to manipulate and seduce Judah to give her what she was owed in terms of levirate marriage. Rahab was a prostitute in Jericho, but was faithful to the spies, and so she became part of the community. Ruth uncovered Boaz's feet and kind of seduced him into a marriage, and became part of the community through Naomi. And then, of course, Uriah's wife is Bathsheba. And David effectively, well, let's be honest, you can't deny the king, so he forced her to have sex with him. And then killed Uriah because Uriah was going to find him out. But she also became the mother of Solomon. So you've got already the father of the tradition, who is also himself a convert, so to speak. You have women who had questionable backgrounds or unconventional methods. And that gives legitimacy to the fact that Mary is one of many of these women and shows the fidelity of God to the community. Then, what's interesting is you also have the fulfillment of David, the monarchy, which plays through. And then, what's interesting is in this last set of 14, only 3 of the names are actually in the Old Testament. The rest are in the in-between times, what we call the Second Temple era. And that's significant because it reminds us that if we only read the Old Testament and only read the New Testament, we have lost vital information. In fact, almost the entirety of these messianic hopes that we find in the New Testament were developed after most of the texts in the Old Testament were written. It gives us continuity. It gives us storyline. And also, genealogies, the word geneseos, the Greek word, gives a nod to Genesis, as reminding us to go back and look at how this is all tied into the story. And yeah, those are all the technical details. So what does this have to do with the price of bread? Well, why am I talking about this? It's probably not my most entertaining sermon ever. Well, it reminds us that we are in a story that is continuous from generation to generation. That we are in one of the many segments of the story of the faithfulness of God to God's people. It also reminds us that scoundrels, unconventional people who are afraid, are still chosen by God, not because they're worthy, but because God chooses them. That God continues to repeat God's faithfulness to us throughout generations and generations, fulfilling covenants, fulfilling promises, bringing hope of liberation and shalom. Shalom meaning wholeness. We translate it peace, but it's really wholeness, a just and whole world. And we can't really have the ministry of Jesus without all these backstories that make a sense of it all. And it also maps onto the Torah. Like if you look at Numbers, for example, it's a lot of genealogies. So it's a theme mapping on top of a theme, mapping on top of a theme. And we've often been taught that the New Testament is, out of a vacuum, brand new. It's a very unique and different set from the Old Testament. But the truth is, motifs run through both that are consistent with one another. And the hope that we have right now in the midst of the world is when we're anticipating as well the continued promise of God to lead us through and to fulfill the hopes that we have. So as we step into Advent, which oftentimes is treated as like a mini Lent, like, repent for the end is near. No. The notion of the second coming of Jesus has not been fulfilled for over 2,000 years. Why don't we stop focusing on the idea of Jesus coming back and recognize Jesus calling us in our time and our place to be the hands and feet of Jesus, to herald the coming, not in the sense of condemnation, but in the sense of God's love is unconditional, it's transformational, it is faithful, that we can share the light, even in the darkness of the worst things in the world, even in the shortest time of year, when the darkness is most present. That's where the light of God comes in and shines the brightest. So may we remember our stories, our lineage. May we recognize where we come from as we step into this time of anticipation of the coming of our anointed over and over again, as each year we celebrate that. And remember what it is that we are anticipating. Remember who it is that we are following. And remember what the covenant is that we are part of. One where sacrificial love overcomes even the most powerful forces of evil and death in the world, and resurrects triumphant and shares that love with the world.